Hi, folks. Good morning, and welcome to yet another session of Informatica Cloud Tech Tuesdays. This is really second in a part of the December is for Developers theme that we got going. So last week, we talked about automating onboarding new customers into your app, and we talked about the benefits of embedded integration with Ron Lanasson. And this week, we have Nick Brizu, also from the Cloud Platform Adoption team, and he's going to take you through how to maximize capabilities of your API. So whether you're a startup or whether you're an established ISV and you have an API and you want customers to use it, how do you make sure they use it in the appropriate way and they maximize their use from it? So that's what our topic today is geared towards. So the agenda for today, we're going to have a quick recap of what we learned last session. And then I'm going to hand it off to Nick to talk about how applications typically connect with one another through an API, some of the error handling they'd have to go through, some of the challenges of interacting through an API, as well as the benefits of building a native connector to an application. We'll then have a summary of our learnings for this session, Q&A, and then we'll go into what we're going to talk about for our next Tech Tuesday session. So with that, let's just do a quick recap about what we learned last session. So we talked about embedding integration with Informatica Cloud and why that's beneficial. So we talked about if you were a cloud ISV and you have your customers that want to integrate with you through some other applications, and the best way to do that is to make sure they interact and integrate with those other applications through your own UI. You want to maintain complete control of your user interface because when you do that, you get repeat users, you get viral growth, and as a result, the adoption of your own application increases. And we talked about how to do that through Informatica Cloud and how there's several customers already doing that today. And in fact, one of our customers, Encino, will be appearing next week's session to talk about how they did it. So that in a nutshell is a quick recap of what we learned last session. And with that, I'm now going to hand the ball over to Nick Brizu, who's going to take you through how apps typically connect and why you should build a native connector.
Thanks, Ashwin, and good morning, everybody. So, as Ashwin was mentioning, perhaps in one of the ways that you've tried to make your application easier to access for your customers, particularly in the context of moving data in and out of your application, is you've put together some web services APIs, so perhaps a REST or a SOAP API. And maybe internally your own application connects to systems on the back end. Perhaps they're relational, maybe it's some cloud services like Salesforce, or even cloud-based database services like Amazon RDS or Redshift. Now, if your customers want to automate some of that data movement in and out of your application, they're going to have to do a couple of things. They're going to have to learn, first of all, how to use your API and read the documentation, and then figure out how to access each of the objects that they're going to work with. So, for example, if you were working with a REST API and you're working with JSON, you're going to have to define those objects and fields in the JSON format. Then they're going to have to make REST calls for the object and the fields that they want to access. And then they're going to need to do that for every single object and for every single field. And as you can imagine, this can be quite a time-consuming task. And in addition, what if your API changes? Or what if the object changes? Then they have to go back and modify code. Another big part of programming that takes a lot of time is handling errors. And of course, they're going to have to put in logic to handle those errors as they are returned from your application. And what if you change the way those errors are generated? Again, they're going to have to go back and handle all those situations. Well, one of the ways that you can hide all that complexity from your customers is to build an Informatica connector. And what that allows you to do is hide a lot of that detail level implementation and let your customers work at a higher business object level, at a metadata layer, to move data in and out of your application. So let's go see what that looks like in practice. So we're going to go into Informatica Cloud and take a look at what it takes to move data back and forth between a source and a target. So we're going to create what we call a synchronization task, which is basically, again, moving data back and forth between two places. So we're going to do an insert operation here. And the first thing we need to do is we're going to go choose a source. Now this is where once you've built your connector to your application, your customer would come here and choose that source. So for example, if I chose Microsoft SQL Server, instead of having to program one connection logic to Microsoft SQL Server on your end, and in your case you would have a REST API that allows connection to the backend system, not only do they not have to worry about that, they just have to provide connection information, but we dynamically query all the objects that are at that source or target. So in this case, once I choose the account information, I get all the data back that's available in the account object that's located in your system. So as you can see, instead of having to work with JSON or query every object that I need, this is all done dynamically at runtime. So if anything changes, if you add more objects or more fields, the Informatica Cloud engine will pick up all those changes dynamically. So we'll do the same thing here for target. And here I'll pick, let's say an MS SQL up in Amazon RDS. Again, the same idea, dynamically querying all the objects available and dynamically querying all the fields that are available. So now, for your customers, when they want to move and choose the fields that they want to put into that system, it becomes an exercise of drag and drop instead of having to code. So for example, if I wanted to bring in the billing street, I just have to drag over the billing street. In addition, by leveraging the power of our engine sitting on top of your API that is now hidden from your customer, we can bring in things like all the transformations that are available to the Informatica Cloud Agent engine. And this means that you don't have to code any of this because it's built into the engine. So lots of powerful transformations are available that allow you to manipulate the data and enrich it. In addition, we can do things like lookups into other systems to bring in external data. So perhaps your backend system is a system of record that you're trying to move data into, but some information you have to go get from external sources at the time that you're bringing in the data in from your customer. So perhaps it's some information about them that's located in Salesforce. Again, we can at runtime dynamically query what's available there and then bring back all the objects and pick the specific information that we need. So we've talked a little bit here about what's the value in building a connector. So what does it take to do this? So we've created a quick start guide that's available to you on our community site. The link is here. And in addition to that, we provide some sample connectors to get you going. So we provide two sample connectors. We have a functioning Salesforce.com connector, and this one is to highlight working with web services that you're trying to connect to, perhaps on your own internal backend system, and also a JDBC connector sample. So, for example, if you're trying to build a connector on top of your own relational backend system. Remember, when you're building a connector, you're not just providing direct link to the backend structures, but you want to provide a higher level, more of a business object type of connection. So we do have a full tutorial for making the development very quick. And I do want to mention something here. A couple of months ago, we were working with a new partner, and we had not discussed with them actually building a connector. It wasn't something that had come up in the pre-sale cycle. And when we met with them for our kickoff, one of the developers there said, hey, I found your tutorial on your website, and I built the first version of the connector we're going to need in about 2 weeks. So it was a pretty quick exercise for him to get his first version out so he could start testing on our sandbox site. So one of the reasons that it's very easy to develop a connector is that we've provided a very clear, almost like a wizard-like experience in the documentation to what you need to do to implement the connector. So we put in markers in Eclipse that allow you to follow along with the documentation. And let me show you what that looks like so you can get an idea of how easy it is. So let's take a look at Eclipse. And here we're looking at our sample JDBC connector. So in the Eclipse project itself, we've put in some markers that you can double-click to go to the places in the code where you need to do modifications. And the nice thing is that we've also, in our documentation itself, you can see here that you can follow along with what's going on in the tutorial documentation, and that matches with all the markers that are in the Eclipse project. So once you've finished your implementation and you've gone through all the steps in the Java code that you need to code to, we've also provided an Ant file that allows you to build and test your connector before you actually move it onto our cloud sandbox for you to test with. So this simplifies the deployment process. So when you run the Ant file, the Ant build script, it will actually not only build all the Java code, but run through all the unit tests. And if all the unit tests pass, it will package it up into a connector package that you can then upload into the cloud sandbox instance. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Ashwin.
So folks, what you saw essentially was you saw Nick take you through some of the problems if you're just utilizing an API itself to connect, as opposed to some of the benefits when you're actually connecting to native objects. And you also saw him take you through how to actually use the Eclipse project as well as the sample code to create this native connector. So if you have any questions about that, please use the chat panel and we'll get to it in the Q&A session. So with that, let's look at this week's Tech Tuesday Tips for Success. So when you're actually building a native connector to your own application, make sure you actually expose the objects that your application uses, not the underlying tables. That way, it's a lot easier for your end users to manipulate the data in and out of that object, as well as any sort of transformations they want to do to any of the fields in the object. Also, as far as basic unit tests are concerned, they're provided for a lot of standard operations, such as connecting and reading the entire catalog of objects that your application has. But the recommendation is that you create ones that suit your own application's objects and operations. And of course, as it goes without saying, don't forget documentation when you develop your native connector. So with that, we now are going to go into the Q&A session. And the first question, Nick, is about the version of Java that we're using. So what version of Java do you have to have in order to use the connector toolkit?
Sure. So as of our most recent release, we currently support Java 1.7 on 32-bit JVM. And I want to point out that all the prerequisites are documented in the SDK tutorial. So it'll tell you exactly what versions of Java, which libraries, how to set all that up. But I also want to mention that, as you can imagine, the world has moved to a 64-bit world with the need for more memory and operations. So we will be releasing a 64-bit agent and hence a 64-bit toolkit SDK sometime in the spring.
Awesome, great. The next question we have here is actually from a customer. So The question is, the customer wants to know if they want to build a connector that they don't want to make publicly available. So it looks like they're not a typical ISV that wants to make their APIs publicly available. So they want to build a connector to a certain application and make sure it's not publicly available. Can this be done, and how to do it?
That's a great question, Ashwin. So in the context, and this has been the theme of our December month, in the context of embedding Informatica Cloud, where we're doing what's known as white labeling, which is essentially you're embedding all our functionality in your software, and nobody really knows necessarily that it's Informatica running in the background. When you develop a connector, you may not want to make that publicly available to all of Informatica's customers. Perhaps you don't see any value in that, and the only thing you want to do is leverage that for your own customers. So we can support where only essentially your organization, as we would call it, has access to that connector, and only your customers have access to it. So it would not be a publicly available connector that you would see, for example, on our marketplace, or in one of those pull downs where you saw all my connections. Now, if you choose to do that because maybe you're more interested in just building a connector to your software solution, and you just want to make it easy for people to integrate with your solution, then of course we can go the other way and make it completely publicly available along with a free trial, the way we usually distribute our cloud solution. Great question.
Great, thanks. And I just want to add to it that we actually have had an instance like this in the past. So we've had a major health insurance company that wanted to build their own version of a connector to a marketing automation application, and they were able to do so. And it's just privately available just to their own set of customers alone. So yes, it can be done.
I just want to add to that. As Ashwin knows, I work quite a bit with our what we call our OEM partners, and I would say almost exclusively that is the way that they decide to go. They will make their connector private, particularly in the initial goings of their project. They may decide down the line to make it public, but so far, most of the partners I've worked with, they've all made their connector private.
Great. The next question here on the list is a question around the operations that can be performed. So what kinds of operations can be performed using this connector SDK?
So at the simplest level, the connector SDK supports read, write, delete, and what we would call upsert, which is insert or update type of operation. Now, when you're developing your connector, you don't have to support all of those operations. There's only a couple of requirements, and that's that. Of course, you have to code some way of connecting to your application, and in addition, get the sort of what we would call the catalog of objects and fields that are available in your system. But if you just wanted to create a read connector, that would be perfectly fine, because you don't think anybody would ever want to necessarily write data into your application. And by the same token, you could create a connector that only supports write operations, because your customers will never be extracting data out of your application.
Great. Thanks for that. We have a question from a startup. And the question is that they still don't have an API defined for their application yet. So how can they use the connector SDK?
So the good news is if you haven't defined an API yet, or as is sometimes the case, you have an API, but it's really only used internally. That is, you don't make it publicly available to your customers in the outside world. You really need just a minimal set of APIs to support to be able to implement a connector. And I touched on it a little bit with the previous question. So of course you're going to need an API that lets you authenticate, so some kind of login mechanism, because at the time that we run a data movement task, we're going to have to authenticate and log into your system. And then we're going to need an API that gives us the catalog of objects. And that's what I showed you in the TSS task earlier, which is once I connect, what are all the objects that I can work with? and then subsequently, what are the fields in those objects? So very generically, give me a list of those things so that I can work with them. And then really the other APIs are going to depend on what kind of operations you want to support. So, read, write, and delete, kind of self-explanatory, but you'll need to have APIs to support those types of operations. But that's pretty much it. So it's a very minimal set of APIs that you would need to support, because again, remember that a lot of the functionality that you're going to get by using Informatica Cloud, you're not going to have to develop, right? Because our engine will take care of that. So as long as we can get, a list of objects and a list of fields, and then the ability to read or write that information, and we can do all the rest with the transformations and the combining it with other data, or combining it with other external sources of data, and at the same time, you get this benefit of being able to access all the systems that we connect to, which is, I believe, we're up to about, we got over 50 connectors available on our marketplace.
Great. Thanks for that, Nick. And it looks like those are all the questions we have for the day. So let's do a quick wrap-up and next steps. So as far as next steps, for those of you that are ISVs on the call, you may want to go and join the Informatica Cloud developer community. That's at informaticacloud.com/developers. And it redirects you to the cloud community site, but it redirects you to the developer portion of that site. And for those of you that want to go ahead and build a native connector and test it out, you'll need to sign up for a developer account. So the URL for that is up there. It's icinq1.informaticacloud.com and /SAS/registeruser.do. So just let you folks go ahead and take that URL down. If you want to go ahead and get some of the toolkit documentation, some of the code samples in the connector SDK that Nick just showed, those are also on the community site, and it's actually within the Informatica Cloud developer community. And once you've actually developed your native connector and you want to test it out on the sandbox, go ahead and email Nick. That's his email over there, nbrizu@informatica.com. And as far as next week's Tech Tuesday is concerned, it's going to be the final in our three-part series of the December is for Developers theme. And that particular session is about doing really, really complex integration to the power of templates and then embedding that in your user interface. So it really builds upon the theme that we've been talking about all through along. The benefits of embedding integration, how to build a native connector using your API, and then how do you embed all the complex integration functionality and integrating those with other systems directly into your user interface. And for next week's Tech Tuesday, we're actually going to have a customer, Encino, who actually works with a lot of community banks, and they're a fast, innovative startup growing in North Carolina. And we're going to have one of the developers from that startup join us and talk to us about how they embedded integration with Informatica Cloud. So with that, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us for this session. Join us next Tuesday, same time, 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and we will see you until then. Thanks once again.